With the highly anticipated presidential election just days away, social media platforms are boosting their efforts to curb the spread of misinformation. Twitter, Facebook, and other popular networks are now changing their rules out of concern about potentially dangerous or misleading information about the November results, which may not be official until days or maybe even weeks after the presidential vote. So Axios Media reporter Sarah Fisher is joining us now with a look at the various plans that they are putting into action. Hey, Sarah, we always love it when you're on this show. I feel like I'm so much smarter after you talk with us. So explain to us what Twitter is doing to brace for election night.
It's good to see you, Emery and Vlad. Yes, they're doing a lot of things. First and foremost, they're going to limit the spread of misinformation by making it harder to share tweets that have been flagged as having misinformation or as having things that are false. So, for example, if a candidate announces on Twitter that they've won a race, but it hasn't been officially called yet that they won it, Twitter is going to put a label on that tweet, and they're going to make it a lot harder to share it, so you can't necessarily retweet it or like it. Some other actions that they're taking: they're going to be labeling more tweets that previously had misinformation that they might not have put labels on. They're going to start putting those labels on now. They're also going to limit what shows up in your feed. So before they made these changes, if something was going viral, it might show up in your feed as X, Y, and Z liked it. They're no longer going to put it in your feed. So that way, if something's going viral that has incorrect misinformation, you're not going to be inclined to see it and then share it as well.
I guess the question, Sarah, with regards to how other social media sites are handling it is this too little too late? And does it sow more confusion when it's not really clear what the criteria is? In other words, there are some things that are floating out there that are clearly misinformation, but that they slide through, and then other things get flagged, and it's sort of not, it doesn't make sense, sort of like the president talking about masks and Dr. Fauci talking about masks. I mean, it's two sort of totally different things that for the common person makes it really, really hard to know what the bar is.
Okay,
and just to sort of jump into Vlad's question as kind of an example, you know, one of the only tweets that I ever had blocked on my own page was a tweet that the president had sent out that was blocked, that I was actually clarifying the information, identifying the misinformation, but it just got thrown sort of in the proverbial trash like all the rest of the stuff.
These are great questions. So let's take the first one. Is it too little too late? Some of these changes address a specific environment related to the election and voting. And so I actually think that they were timely enough to address them. So, for example, Facebook says you can no longer purchase ads after the polls close on Election Day. Google just made that announcement as well. That's not too little too late. We're not at Election Day yet. They made this policy beforehand, so I think that's pretty smart. To your question, though, about is some of these other changes too little too late, I mean, yeah, there's massive conspiracy theories like QAnon that are now in the public conscious because these platforms let them spur for years and years before taking action, you know, this month. To your point about policy enforcement and whether or not it's sort of ad hoc, I think that they're right now playing whack-a-mole. When they see an instance come up, they scramble and they create a policy that tries to address it. But in doing that, they're inadvertently creating confusion around how these policies are ubiquitously enforced. And I think, Amory, what you were saying, enforced, what you were saying is a great example of that. You could have journalists that are just trying to clarify a piece of misinformation that gets blocked because Twitter hasn't quite yet come up with the technology and the policies to address how journalists talk about these types of things. Another issue we're seeing is comedy. What happens if you have a very obvious satirical account that's trying to make fun of a situation, but Twitter accidentally flags it as misinformation? All of these problems are going to take years and years to hammer out. And I worry sometimes that people are going to get so frustrated why tech platforms hammer these out that they're just going to say, to hell with this, these social platforms are biased. And that's going to create some problems.
Yeah, that's kind of like when you asked about whether it's sort of too little too late, Vlad, I thought about the fact that when you see that a tweet has been blocked, this also feeds into these conspiracy theories, because part of what they say is the mainstream media doesn't want you to know this. And so instantly, like without sort of trying, by blocking some of this stuff, they then add more fuel to the conspiracy theorist fires, if you will. But so we've been like, thumbs down for what these social media platforms are doing. But in general, are they better than they were at least in 2016? I mean, they've had 4 years to try and get it better, to try and do it right.
They're much better. I mean, they were not on top of this at all in 2016, which is what's led to a flood of congressional hearings. It's what's led to boycotts and investor pressure. They're much better. And one thing I think they've gotten particularly better at is in the aftermath of the 2016 election, they were so focused on foreign interference that I don't think they had their eye on domestic interference, on conspiracies that were spreading from accounts and from movements within the United States. That's something that they've gotten so much better at combating and taking action on. To address your point about inadvertently making something worse than it is, this is something that's called the Streisand effect, where if you address something by blocking it, you might inadvertently make it even worse. And I've talked to misinformation experts. The general sense here is you don't want to touch a conspiracy theory. You don't want to address it. You don't want to block it until it's hit 10% of the mainstream population. Once 10% of people know about it, that's a good time to take action on it. But if you try to address it, and that might even mean stop the spread of it before it hits that 10% threshold, you might inadvertently make it worse by drawing more attention to it.
So let me ask you about this, Sarah. Twitter made headlines this week when it blocked the New York Post article about Vice President Joe Biden's son, Hunter. What was the company's reasoning behind the move, and do you think this went beyond the platform's agenda to curb misinformation?
Yes, great question. So a lot of people thought Twitter did that because it was trying to moderate content. Actually, this is not a content moderation issue for Twitter. This is a cybersecurity issue for Twitter. Twitter has what's called a hacked materials policy. Facebook and Google and other platforms have similar policies. After the DNC emails leaked in 2016, platforms realized that there is going to be efforts by bad actors to illegally obtain information, slightly tweak it, and dump it right before the election to sway the election results. As a result, when Twitter or Facebook or Google see something, a story like this that could potentially smell like a hack and leak, immediately they put up their misinformation systems and they just shut it down. Now, Twitter last night conceded, hey, I think we went a little too far. Instead of blocking it, maybe we should have just done what Facebook did and slow the spread of it while we evaluate whether or not this really is a hack and leak, Vlad. But unfortunately, conservatives, people on the right, were very quick to say Twitter is censoring our views. They didn't want to believe that this story could potentially be a cybersecurity problem, a hack and leak.
Well, speaking of censorship, at what point does curbing misinformation become a violation of free speech?
Oh, that's the biggest question out there. I mean, look, we have dealt with some of these issues in the past with traditional mediums. So with broadcast and radio and newspapers, there's a reason why when you turn on your mainstream cable or your mainstream broadcast, there's certain levels of nudity that you're not seeing. There's certain requirements to the type of commercials that can be exposed. We have laws that govern this. We actually have a body, the FCC, that governs those mediums. We don't exactly have that for social media platforms. We have a very old law that governs them. It kind of shields them from taking liability for misinformation on their platforms. Right now, you have in Congress a lot of people that are talking about whether or not we need to reevaluate the laws that govern these platforms so that we can have a clear distinction between censorship and empowering First Amendment. We're not there yet, but I'm optimistic. We've made such great strides between 2016 and 2020. It's a lot more awareness around the problem. I think eventually, maybe not in the next few years, but eventually we're going to get to a point where we have laws that can better make these distinctions for us online.
You know, it's just so difficult, though, I think, Sarah and Anne-Marie, because, for example, Anne-Marie, you often talk about people sharing weird posts on your Facebook feed, right? And you sometimes try to correct those posts. The President of the United States, Sarah, and Anne-Marie, you may not have seen this because it just happened in the last couple of hours, but the President of the United States retweeted a tweet with a headline from a satirical newspaper, the Babylon Bee. It's not a real newspaper, but the article and the headline, the President retweeted it and added more information around it as if it was real. And so I don't know. I mean, if you don't know, we work in the media world, so if you will probably know the Babylon Bee is not a real newspaper, it's a satirical newspaper. But if you don't know that, and you see it coming from the President of the United States, and you're following his Twitter feed, and you've got to deal with the kids and your jobs, then you might actually think that this is real. This is, I guess, and I don't know what the role of social media is in a situation like that.
Comedy is one of the toughest things to handle in terms of the First Amendment, and by the way, always has been. This is why when we talk about First Amendment rights, you're always going to see people like the founders and creators of South Park, up talking about it, because comedy is really hard to determine whether or not you put certain restrictions on it for the sake of public safety and public knowledge. Here's what I imagine is one day going to happen, Vlad. One day, you might have to register as being a satirical site, and you'll have a specific label on your tweet or on your account, so that if someone like the president were to retweet it with additional context, it would become more obvious to the user that this is satire. The problem right now with a lot of social media sites is that all of the branding blends together. There's no way to easily distinguish if something is comedy, if something is news. Everybody's adhering to the same formats and the same fonts. The news lobbyists are going crazy about this. They're trying really hard to make it so that you can better distinguish brands online. But until we get to that point, Vlad, as you said, this is going to be really, really hard for the average everyday American to filter through. And it's not just comedy. It's also opinion journalism, analysis and blogs versus true breaking news stories. We're still right now trying to figure out how do we label all this stuff so that it's clearer on the internet.
Sarah Fisher, Anne-Marie, we miss Sarah being in the studio with us
really
every
do.
Tuesday like we had pre-Rona.
Because the thing about Sarah is you can take the conversation like a little to the left and a little to the right, and she'll unpack everything, like the knowledge, because she has so much knowledge that you can go anywhere with her.
Yeah, you don't mean politically left and right. You mean like our winding the roads of our minds.
Pretty much. Yes.
I just didn't know people will be adding us all day long on Twitter if you say that. So, yes, we do have long and winding conversations. Sarah Fisher, always great to see you. Thank you very much.
Good to see you too. Bye.